Hey everyone, JC here. Welcome back to my World at War series, episode 4. So, if you remember a while ago, I said I was only going to do 2 episodes, and then, unfortunately, the war is still going on, so I have to keep talking about it. First, I want to explain what I'm going to talk about today, and then we'll jump into it. So, I want to talk about the Russian lies. We had a lot of them, and we still keep having a lot of them. And also, I want to look a little bit at NATO, but actually, this also goes back to the Russian lies. So it's kind of like still the same thing, but just maybe a little bit different. So the first thing I want to do here is to talk about fascism, actually, because I had a very interesting exchange recently. Let me get the picture here. There it is. So I had a very interesting exchange because you see, in my family, well, I'm from New York myself, but my family are mostly from Russia, actually. And so what happened is a kind of classic scenario where, like in America, when Trump became president, like a lot of families got disconnected, let's say, because they don't want to, like, once they knew that one of their family members supports Trump, who is basically like for fascism as well, they're like, oh, okay, so we're not going to talk to you anymore, like we're done. And the same thing happened with Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. So if, like, for example, I cannot stand a person who is what we call a Z patriot, like somebody who supports the war. I'm sorry, but I just can't. We can talk about the weather if you want, but I'm sorry, the life is a little bit more than just talking about things like the weather. Okay, so yeah, I had to cut off some people in my family over this because I just find it unacceptable in the 21st century that you have these kind of barbaric views. And it's not just about the war. You see, in Russia, the old generation, not all, of course, thank God for that, but there is a certain percentage of the people, old people, who are also very racist. They use the N word still quite openly. For example, when Barack Obama was president, they're like, how could Americans elect the, N word? And they say it as absolutely normal. Like they don't think twice about it. It's just automatic for them. That's how they grew up. That's how they were educated, I guess. And yeah, so racism and xenophobia in general. So, but first, let's talk about fascism, okay? Because I think like a lot of people don't actually understand what it is. People have some conceptions, some preconceptions of what it is, but when you sit down and actually look at the definition, they're like, oh, okay, I actually didn't know like 90% of it. I just thought it's like people wearing swastikas, running around and murdering Jews. Well, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. So let's go through the definition. And I just went with a very kind of, classic definition, which is not even probably a dictionary definition, but it's from Wikipedia. So it's not perfect, but I quite like it because I think it covers all the bases. So I'll just read it and we'll discuss it. Fascism is a far right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation and race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. So, just looking at the definition here, I feel like some of the things are actually like repetitions of themselves, but maybe that's because I just don't know every single nuance of this. So, let's talk about some of this and let's see how it applies to Russia. And the first thing I want to mention here is that, you know, it's change is usually gradual. I mean, of course, like if somebody comes in here and you know kills my best friend, of course I'm gonna be like pissed and angry and most likely would want to seek revenge. And that would be a very abrupt change in my behavior, justified but abrupt nonetheless. But when we talk about politics and stuff, most of the time it's very gradual, and so people don't even realize it. Uh, for example, they went very to the far right. They slipped down the slope to the far right, and they don't realize it because, again, it's like a sudden change. It's very incremental, it's very slow, but it's very methodical. And so later, when you point out to them, like, hey, you're actually a far right fascist, they're like, no, me, not at all. I'm very far from fascism. And yet they are. And yet they are. So let's talk about the definition now. So it's a far right ideology, authoritarian, okay, ultranationalist. So we know this applies to Russia because it's basically, you know, an authoritarian. So that's actually, it means just a dictator in power. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Ultranationalist. So, this is somebody who promotes the Russian race. Well, that's not a thing. Like white people. I mean, I'm not even okay. I'll say it like once and forever. I don't believe in like races. We are just one human race. Yes, we have different skin colors, sure, but we are still humans. Like I have, my certain way of being, and if you compare me to somebody from Africa, they have the exact same characteristics. Okay, we have like a little bit different hair, maybe. Obviously, skin color is different, uh, but we are human. That's just period. So I don't really buy this thing about racism. I don't look at people, I don't see different races. I see different people, yes, but I don't see them as different races. I don't know, maybe I'm just more kind of enlightened, advanced than other people. That could be the case. Like I said before, in Russia, people still casually flaunt around the N word, okay? So, am I better than those people? Fuck yeah, for sure. All right, so ultranationalist, this is basically a way to promote, again, the Russian race as superior. We'll come back to that in a second. Characterized by a dictatorial leader, okay, so that's definitely Putin. I mean, he's been in power about 20 years. I know there was I think a 4-year period where his puppet Medvedev was president, but during that time, Putin was actually the vice president. So he didn't like go away. Okay, he was still very much in there, and he was the one pulling the strings. It was kind of a stunt, if you want. Like, yeah, I give this illusion of democracy. You see, I'm not president. He's the president. But every Russian really knows, except, if you're too far gone, every Russian knew that it was really Putin who was in power. So over 20 years in power, he changed the constitution. He altered the constitution so that he could stay in power longer. Because I think in Russia we had a limit of 2 terms. I think there was no exception back then. Maybe you could come back as vice president or something, but you could definitely not become president again. And yet he became president again. He just changed the constitution, and hey, I'm like that. Now I think now he's trying to change the constitution again, so that he can stay in power forever. Okay, so that's definitely a dictator. You can't say anything against that. Centralized autocracy. So if people don't know what centralized autocracy means a system of government by one person with absolute power. Okay, so this is Putin, because he's trying to sometimes, in some rare instances, this can be good because maybe there is a crisis and the people who are dealing with it are just like completely incompetent. That happens very often in Russia. And maybe he steps in, and maybe that particular situation gets better. So yeah, there are certain things maybe that get a little bit better, but it doesn't take away from the the tens, the hundreds of bad things that he's done while in power. And anyway, he's trying to control everything. That's the point here. Militarism, so that's for sure. Like, I mean, the Ukraine invasion is a very good example of this. Like, now it's undeniable. But even way before that, you had the in 2008, I think, you had the annexation of two Georgian republics. I'm not talking about the U.S. state. I'm talking about the country, Georgia. Basically, he did the same trick as he did in Ukraine. So he said, okay, in these two provinces, there's a lot of Russian speakers or something. So we're gonna proclaim these two provinces independent. And then, so what happens if you look at the map? Well, the provinces are independent, yes, but they are, kind of occupied by Georgia. So now Georgia becomes the occupier, and Russia has to go in and kick them out, kick the Georgians out of their own land. And that trick worked for some reason. I'm still trying to figure out why. My theory is that it was back in 2008, and if you remember, at the time, most of the world was very preoccupied with a stock market crash. Okay, and I think that's why Putin was able to get away with it, because everybody was just focused on the crash and didn't pay any attention to what's happening in Georgia. Now, I have a second theory about that, but that might maybe also debatable. It's not really true, by the way, but in some instances, Georgian people are a bit more dark-skinned than, let's say, the average Russian. Like, average Russian is very white, but okay, they're a little bit more dark-skinned. Their hair is a little bit different, very black hair, etc., etc. And we saw that in Iraq, for example. Nobody, come on, if you're from the American perspective, nobody really cares about Iraqis or Afghanis or Pakistanis, etc., etc. It's just unfortunate, but there is definitely a layer of racism in there, for sure. And I feel like maybe because Georgians are a bit darker skinned, that we just didn't care about them so much, whereas we care about Ukraine because, well, they're white people. I don't know. This is very debatable. Could it be part of the equation? Maybe, but kind of question marks there. I think the crash was definitely a much bigger reason not to act back then. But anyway, he did that, and then he did the exact same trick in Ukraine. So militarism, forcible suppression of opposition. Now, if you actually study Russian politics over the past 20 years, now there were instances where, for example, there was a politician of the opposition called Boris Nemtsov. He was actually murdered on a street in Moscow, like not even like some kind of back street, but a relatively big street, just murdered. A car stopped near him. I think he was shot or something, and then they just drove away. And I still think to this day they were not caught, obviously, because, if they are agents of the FSB, which is basically the new KGB, well, of course they're not going to be prosecuted because it was an ordered hit by the government, right? So definitely that happens. Another good example is Alexei Navalny. He is, I think he's also part of the opposition. He was basically poisoned on a flight. He was flying to Germany, if I'm not mistaken. He was poisoned. He felt like tea poisoning. Somebody like put poison in his tea at the lounge, and he drank it, and he got poisoned. He survived because of the very rapid intervention and the German healthcare system. But he could have actually chosen to stay in Germany and maybe, fight some kind of PR war from there. But he's not that kind of person. He went back to Russia, and of course, at the border, he was immediately arrested. And to this day, he's still in jail. There is absolutely no news when he's going to come out or anything, okay? So definitely dissent is not allowed. If you are, I mean, look, if you just like live your life, you go to your work and you go back, etc., and you watch TV at night, probably nothing's going to happen to you in Russia. But once you start to have political views which are in opposition to Putin, well, then you enter a kind of danger area. Then it really depends what you say, because some things you say might be considered too far. So, and then they will take action on you. Now, whether they murder you, that's debatable, but they can definitely throw you to jail. They will invent reasons to put you to jail, and then you'll be gone. So yeah. Okay, so after that, subordination of individual interests from the perceived good of the nation and race. Okay, so again, race comes back into the definition, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. Okay, so again, this is from Wikipedia, but I think it's a pretty good definition. All right, next, what I want to talk about is the initial lies of Putin. So I think I already covered that in my previous videos, so please go check them out, because I don't want to repeat myself in every video. It becomes very like not good. So I'll just talk about a few of them, okay? And one of them is that before the war started, so that was just before February 24th sometime, a few days before that, because remember, it happened very kind of quickly. There was the proclamation of independence, and then Putin said, "Oh yeah, okay, we're starting the special operation right now," and everybody was like just what's going on? Like we're going in, and but you know, a soldier. That's my one complaint about soldiers. So you know, like for example, a doctor is paid to basically take care of patients, to cure the patients. Etc., etc. That's their duty. Police officer, it's to, you know, stop crimes or break up fights or something like that, put people to jail. A firefighter is to stop fires or to save some cat who got stuck in a tree. I mean, look, they have a duty, okay? And a soldier's duty is basically just to, well, it's to fight, yes, but it's to obey orders. You are paid to obey orders. Now, these orders can be absolutely insanely, like batshit insane, but you are a soldier. Like, this is your job. Your job is not to question the order. Your job is to execute the order. And that's my one complaint about soldiers, is that we have a bunch of drones instead of people who can, you know, think on their feet. I know that in battlefield situations, of course, you know, things happen, and yeah, you get a bit more independence. But if it's a big decision, like okay, we're going to war, you know, the same thing happened with the U.S. when they went to Iraq. Bush says, you know, we're going to war. Tens of thousands of soldiers get shipped to Iraq, equipment, tanks, etc., and the war starts. No questioning, nothing. I obey the order. So, before the war started in Ukraine, Putin claimed that Ukraine is committing genocide. But in my view, I know people, okay, this is another point of contention that I have with Russians. Some Russians always say that, well, everybody's lying and propaganda is everywhere. That's only true to a certain extent. Because, for example, I cover a lot of things about climate change. So if I say that, well, you know, very soon we're looking at temperatures increases of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius compared to the Industrial Revolution, or pre-Industrial Revolution days, I should say, that's actually a very quite accurate factual statement. I'm not lying to you about it. And this is backed up by, you know, I don't know how many papers of people, of actual experts who have looked at it and came to the exact same conclusion. Now, look, in reality, it could be like more. It could be 3 degrees Celsius. And then I could be wrong about that because I underestimated the risk. Granted. but we're still talking about a certain amount of warming, and that's the important part. Now, if you go the other route and you say, well, no, it's actually cooling, you are free to say that, but I'm also free to call you an absolute idiot because you don't know what you're talking about. You looked at some misinformation about climate change. For you, maybe you had a bias, initial bias. Maybe, you think like every year, maybe it's getting a little bit colder because you feel like it, and you have a bias. So you're gonna find information these days on the internet about everything, and that includes misinformation, of course, about climate change. So if you wanna find stuff about global cooling, you will find it. Look, it's out there. But is it actually accurate? Is it factual? Is the argument sound and valid, or valid and sound, I should say? It isn't. So then we don't need to pay attention to it too much. There is no evidence for that thing. And with the Russians, it's the same thing. They always say everybody's lying, etc. Well, I just gave you an example. I am not lying to you. Okay? So there are other things where I might be kind of doing small white lies, sure, from time to time, but that's the point. Like not everybody and not all the time people are lying, okay? That's just not true. And with regards to propaganda, propaganda is a bit more difficult because it's true that both sides are trying to push something, and there is definitely certain biases being imposed on people. So that depends on the organization and what their mission is, who their funders are, etc., etc. And in that case, it becomes, well, maybe there is no perfect truth. Everybody's doing like kind of bias confirmation, but then it just depends on the degree of that, like who does it more than others. And if you're as impartial as possible, then probably you are a decent source of information. But anyway, so the genocide claims that Putin made were actually not founded. And the evidence for that is before the conflict started, I'll just read from the article here. Military intervention to prevent atrocity crimes, which include genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, only gains a degree of legitimacy if clear evidence has been provided to the international community. It's also necessary to collaborate with other countries at the UN or other global or regional multilateral actors. Russia has not done this. Now, again, remember, just before February 24th, the day of the invasion, Putin announced that, yes, there was kind of, ethnic cleansing. I think he even used that. Well, no, he used genocide. Let's be fair there. He used the word genocide. That there was genocide committed by the Ukrainians against Russians living in Ukraine. But that goes back to 2014 because in 2014 there was a presidential election. There was a new president, and certain like parts of the like Donetsk and Luhansk basically started to fight a proxy war, a Russian proxy war. And then it was, of course, supported by Russian military equipment. Now, we know that because Russia shot down a Malaysian airliner. And look, if you're just talking about guerrilla fighters who have maybe Kalashnikovs and maybe some kind of very basic artillery pieces, there's no way you're going to shoot down an airliner that flies, I don't know how many feet in the air, like 35,000 feet usually. But they found out through the investigation that this was done with an advanced, anti-air rocket system. I believe to be the book system, or the buck, I don't know how you call it. There's no way like just the average, fighter can get access to such equipment. That equipment was brought there by Russian army, for sure. And not just that, but other pieces as well. Just a note on that very quickly. If you look at the map here, so let's look at the map for a second. This is the map of the Ukraine. This was basically just before the invasion, okay? If you look at the map, you have Luhansk, Donetsk, and parts of them, so not even the whole states, but just parts of them were what we call separatist-held areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, okay? All right, so now I'll give you an example so you understand exactly what's going on here. Let's say that you have the United States, okay, and you have the state of Texas. Now, let's say that part of Texas now has Mexican, pro-Mexican separatists who are basically waging a war on behalf of Mexico against the US. But it's not really technically Mexico, right? It's just separatists. They're just rebels. And and do you think that in that scenario the US would just say, "Oh, well, fine, whatever, and Texas can become part of Mexico. We don't care." I know that some people might want that in the US, but look, this is no way that's going to be allowed, okay? Or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of like Swiss pro-separatists, pro-Swiss separatists fighting in Quebec, for example, trying to grab a piece of land in Quebec on behalf of the Swiss government. There's no way that Canada would allow it. And by the way, United States and Canada are part of NATO, so if something happens with NATO, they are obliged to reply in some way. All right. So anyway, that's what's going on in 2014. Already illegal, okay, as fuck. But the other interesting thing back then was on 21st of February, okay, so this is still before the invasion. Putin says Russia is considering recognizing, not annexing, Ukraine's breakaway regions. President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia was considering recognizing the independence of two breakaway Ukrainian regions, but not annexing them and formally adding them to its own territory. He made the comments during a long televised meeting of Russia's Security Council, during which all the participants said they backed recognizing the independence of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. An interesting note about that press conference is I believe it was the head of the FSB. I'm not sure about that, don't quote me on that, but I think he was there speaking on the microphone, completely trembling in his boots, because you have to understand, like, a lot of people are just scared of Putin because, again, like, he's very vengeful, he's very wrathful, so he can just toss you into jail and you'll be stripped of everything pretty much, and people don't want that, so people are afraid of him and they just agree with him. That's the easy way. Anyway, he was there completely shaking, his voice was trembling, and he said some bullshit like, yes, I agree that Russia has to annex the two provinces in the Ukraine. And like Putin cut him off at one point, which was all like just a bunch of theater. And he said, "Oh, but who's talking about annexing? We're just talking about liberating them." And he said like, that's what I meant. We're just like liberating them. But okay, in reality, if you had an ounce of intelligence, every Russian knew that eventually there's going to be a referendum. And that referendum, most people are going to vote yes. And then the republics will be annexed. I don't know anybody who says like that's not on the books. That was absolutely on the books. And everybody with a little bit of intelligence could figure it out. That's what's going to happen. And that was a huge, huge lie, of course, that Putin made. There was others, but this was a gigantic one. All right, so next I want to talk about NATO a little bit. So the first thing I want to mention actually is that if you look at the map, and I'll show the map you can actually see the map right now. If you look at the map there is indeed a very long border between Ukraine and Russia. The border itself is about 2,300 kilometers. It's a very long border, and Putin again made back when he made his speech, he was talking about it, and he said that this is a threat because It's a huge border. It's a very open border. So enemy troops can just pour in through there and into Russia. So he really actually sold this idea that, NATO or whoever, but everybody thinks he was talking about NATO at the time. NATO is actually planning a full invasion of Russia. Now, where's the evidence for that? There's none whatsoever. It's just what he said. And then, unfortunately, a lot of people actually believe what he says. I don't know why. Well, power of propaganda. Propaganda, don't underestimate the power of propaganda and the power of stupid people in masses. Definitely, that combination is very explosive. So the border is very big, and he said, okay, so this is a huge border, and troops can easily just pour into Russia through that border. In reality, none of that was going to happen. Nobody ever thought about invading Russia. This is all just invaded. This is all just made up, childish bullshit. Maybe like in the future, I don't know, it's some kind of distant future. Maybe there is some kind of a scenario where, Russia needs to be invaded. I mean, if Russia, for example, is Nazis going around ethnic cleansing, let's say, Asian populations, which, they have a lot in Russia, let's be honest, well, maybe they do deserve to be invaded at that point, So yeah, maybe at some point, sure. But right now, nobody thought about doing something like that. So that's just a made up bullshit. And if he's worried about the Ukraine border, which is 2,300 kilometers, psst, don't tell him how long the border with Kazakhstan is. All right, and the final thing I want to mention here is I want to talk about NATO. So this is yet another lie of Putin. He always liked to say that NATO is advancing towards Russia's borders. And this was based on some kind of technicality. He said that, the Soviet Union at the time, there were promises made that they were not going to expand past, I think the what was it, like the East Germany was supposed to be like off limits or something, but there was nothing else actually said about other countries joining or signing up for it. So that's already not really true. That's a technicality. In reality, though, we look at the map here and you see like I said before, there's also US and Canada who are part of NATO, but in Europe, pretty much most of Europe is part of NATO. Of course, Switzerland and Austria. Well, Switzerland is neutral most of the time anyway. But most other countries are part of NATO. I know that Sweden and Finland recently applied. The important point to make here is that Putin lies when he says NATO is expanding to Russia's borders. Now, this is a big lie because NATO is not expanding. You see, it's a false use of language. NATO is not expanding. So like on the whole, yes, it's getting more members, but it doesn't point a gun to say Romania or Poland or Lithuania and tell them, okay, now you are part of NATO now. You can't say no, or if you say no, we're gonna bring all the armies and occupy you. Like that's just wild, crazy, and that's not the way it works. You basically have a country, let's say, I don't know, Latvia. All right, Latvia is part of NATO now, but before they apply to be part of NATO, okay? There is a certain procedure you have to follow. There are certain rules you have to comply with. There are certain, I don't know, because I'm not, I'm not in NATO, so I don't know. But there is a list of things you have to do in order to be part of the alliance, okay? So if you check all the boxes, if you tick all the boxes, then you are admitted into NATO. That's how it works, and not the other way around that Putin is portraying it. Like, the evil US empire is trying to is basically forcing nations to be part of NATO. That's not the way it works at all. The way it works is just like I explained it. Countries apply, and sometimes they may get rejected. I don't know. It depends if you tick all the boxes or not. But anyway, this is a final lie I want to cover today, that yeah, NATO is expanding and NATO is planning an attack on Russia. That is just absolute nonsense. Don't buy the lies. It's all propaganda. And if you want to, unfortunately these days, like I said in my last videos, the Russian media is mostly banned, so you can't see like RT, you can't see like even regular TV channels are maybe not shown on YouTube so much. But luckily, you still have many Russian people who tape the shows, who do commentary on top of it. You can still find them on YouTube. A lot of them speak English these days, so no problem to understand. And yeah, so if you want to see how the propaganda mill is operating in Russia, then I recommend watching my videos, but also videos of other Russians who, have actually access to these channels, because actually I don't have access. I watch other people, right? But yeah, just understand that it's a lot of propaganda. It's a lot of lies. They're trying to twist everything. And so how it will pan out, I don't know, but probably I will make more videos in the future. So stay tuned, subscribe to my channel, make sure you click the bell button so you're notified of my videos. Now, mostly I make videos about climate change, but I will also do these videos on politics from time to time if people find it interesting. So that's it for today. I hope you have a good time, and stay tuned to the news in general. Pay attention to what's going on, because once people stop paying attention, that's when you start to kind of slip into kind of the far right or the far left. Sometimes depends on the spectrum. All right, that's it. JC signing off. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.